Hello, I'm Jim Schaefer, the host and producer of Rip Rap, the academic book television program. My guest today is Earl Lewis, who is not only a professor of history, but also Dean of the School of Graduate Studies at the University of Michigan. Dean Lewis is co-author of Love on Trial, An American Scandal in Black and White, and the co-editor of To Make Our World Anew, A History of African Americans. Welcome to Rip Rap.
Thank you.
Before we begin the discussion of these two books, I should point out that we are indeed making history today in two ways.
This is the first time we've ever interviewed anyone for Rip Rap on a stage, even though this stage is in the auditorium of the beautiful Rackham Graduate School building at the University of Michigan Central Campus in Ann Arbor. Second, this is the first time we've interviewed anyone on a stage because that person's office is part of a massive renovation that will take 2 years to complete.
Indeed.
So again, thank you for agreeing to this interview under these circumstances.
As I prepared for this interview, it did seem the stage is a very appropriate place since the notions of appearance and identity intertwine throughout both of your books. First, I'd like to talk a little bit about your book, To Make Our World Anew, and the selection to you from the poetry of Langston Hughes, which provides not only a very fitting beginning for your book, but also for our discussion here. Would you be so kind as to read it?
To you, to sit and dream, to sit and read, to sit and learn about the world, outside our world of here and now, our problem world. To dream of vast horizons of the soul, through dreams made whole, unfettered free, help me. Are you who are dreamers too? All you who are here, all you who are dreamers too, help me make our world anew. I reach out my hands to you. Langston Hughes.
What's fascinating in both these books is the care, precision, and thoroughness that you've got in selections like this, with quotations from poetry, art, and a lot of news media articles. One of the most stunning aspects of your book is the long view it presents of history, reaching as it does all the way back to 1502 and then bringing the narrative up into the present. Even more important, your book accomplishes this without resorting to yet another mere compilation of historical facts. Instead, as you and your co-editor Robin Kelly state from the very beginning, the book seeks to present the dramatic saga of a people attempting to remake the world. As you and Professor Kelly further state, even when they did not succeed, the actions, thoughts, and dreams of Africans are responsible for some of the most profound economic, political, and cultural developments in the modern West. How did this project emerge as you worked on it with Professor Kelly?
The project itself actually started going back to about 1994, so when I was first approached by Oxford University Press about creating a series for young adults, and Robin was then a faculty member here at the University of Michigan, and he and I agreed to be the co-general editors of this series. It amounted to an 11-volume history of African Americans for young adults. At the conclusion of that project, we realized that we could actually re-edit those volumes and create really a one volume that dealt with African American history in a very comprehensive way that also was up to date and blended cultural and social and political and economic history, which was an exciting undertaking.
As we talked just before this interview, this volume has a lot of substance, but it also has that narrative quality.
Well, we wanted to create a volume that people wanted to read, that actually would be compelling, would be interesting, would have a narrative flow. It was a challenge. I mean, it was a challenge to get 10 or 11 voices to read like one voice, or at least 2 or 3 voices instead of 10 or 11. But I think one of the key ingredients is that we found historians who were wedded to trying to write in a way that didn't substitute the important technical nuances and in-depth historical analysis, but also wanted to say it in such a way that was indeed interesting to read.
It must have been interesting to you as a historian to work with the other scholars on this project.
It was both. It was exciting. It was hard. We had a few people, not too many, but we had a few people who dropped out during the course of the project, and we had to replace them with others. The exciting part was actually sitting in the room. We once had a big dinner for all of the collaborators at a meeting of the Organization of American Historians, and we sat down in a group of 11 or so folks, talked about what they wanted to accomplish in creating one single volume, and having around the table people like Peter Woods and Dan Littlefield and Jim Grossman and Barbara Bayer and Nora Lee Frankel and others along with us was a really exciting possibility, and there was energy at that dinner that night as we walked away.
One thing that fascinated me was the way you brought all the different kinds of elements together. There's that one section called "What is Africa to Me?" a line from County Cullen's 1925 poem Heritage. So you see some of the visual, and you see a wide range of the work of African American artists.
We wanted to remind ourselves and our readers that the story of African Americans is partly about the artifacts and the documents that were created. One of the things we know from African history is that there weren't always an abundance of written documents as we think in classical Western terms of written documents. That's not to say that people didn't document their own history. And so what we wanted to do was to illustrate in a real way that you can actually tell several different stories and integrate them in a really significant way by piecing together poetry and paintings and artifacts and other kinds of pieces to tell the story of African Americans.
In the book, you say you revisited the place of Africa in the Black imagination, exploring feelings of community, cultural connection, and spirituality, as well as loss and alienation. One of my favorites is the New Ring Shout, a cosmogram that marks the site of the 18th century African burial ground in Lower Manhattan.
We're pleased, and what was exciting for us is that we were able to integrate some of the most recent findings in African American history, where in that case you had archaeologists combining with culture and social historians to really, in some ways, excavate New York City and reminding yourself, one, of the size of New York during the colonial and early American period, but also a significant African and African American population in New York City and in New York State. And so the burial ground becomes one way of sort of documenting and signifying that there was an African presence in not too far from present-day Wall Street.
Right, and New York's always been a portal. People forget about how many layers of civilization and culture comprise that same spot.
And what a lot of folks don't realize is that African Americans were integrated into the broader New York and New England, so both city and hinterland. A lot of the sailors and folks who navigated the inner rivers in New York and going through the New England were African American or were of African descent at the very least, and so they were an important presence throughout the colonial period. And indeed, in 1741, there was a conspiracy and other kinds of things where slaves were trying to really claim their own freedom in these colonies that would eventually become the United States of America.
That's one of the strong points of your narrative, is that you're able to trace these continuities without losing track of them, and that's pretty hard to do with the complexity.
Yeah, it really is, and I give credit to my colleagues who were part of this overall process and their abilities to really want to take this narrative line and move it forward across time. And our job and then trying to edit it in such a way to make sense out of it all.
I found your chapter, We Changed the World 1945-1970, to be pretty fascinating, since that's the era I remember most. In that chapter, you and your co-authors make an extremely interesting point, that revolutions always exact a price from their participants. Sometimes, in looking back, we forget how people lost their livelihoods, friends, family members, connection to the community, even their lives in the movement to end segregation and, as you say, press America to live up to its creed of justice for all. So there's names like Paul Robeson, James Baldwin, Ralph Abernathy, Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King. But then there's the smaller names like Isabel Blair, Ella Baker, Amzie Moses, James Meredith.
The list goes on. I mean, it's just amazing.
That chapter, and a number of other chapters, but that chapter in particular reminds us is that, for the most part, most people are guardians of the status quo, be they black, white, or other. and in the context of the post-World War II generation, to come in, particularly into the South, but not just in the South, but to come in and try to change things, exacted an incredible price. I mean, price in terms of the psychological damage that sometimes was done to individuals who had to deal with a constant threat of being bombed or being potentially executed. There was really the physical price. I mean, there were people who were being executed, and so they knew that at any moment, on any back road, sometimes in your own home, you could be taken out by the Ku Klux Klan or some other group, and so that was always there, and it was present. There was also, as you sort of noted in your comment, there was a certain alienation that people felt too, because to shake up a community had a reverberation, and there were some folks that said, you know, let's leave it alone. Over time, it would take care of itself, and so folks were worried about losing their own status and their own economic wherewithal if they were associated with the kind of change that was brought about by that generation of men and women and children who really forced the South to deal with the question of democracy and freedom.
I found it fascinating, too, and it reminded me of the fact that a lot of the progress was because of specific people taking specific stances in resistance to the existing laws.
That's right. One of the things we wanted to remind anyone who would read this book is that individuals become leaders, become engaged in social change for a variety of reasons, and that if you look at this period from 1945 onward, that too often, in too many instances, we sort of wrap that story around a charismatic leader, be it a Martin Luther King on a local level or someone, I mean, on a national level or someone else on a local level. But really, it is the action of a whole collection of individuals who themselves can imagine a better world and then who set about to sort of help create that better world. And what's fascinating about this period in the South and the North and the West, in many cases it was youth, it's young people who came of age in the period after World War II and who had said enough's enough. And so they were college students, they were high school students, they were middle school kids in places like Birmingham and Selma and elsewhere who made the world stand up and take attention.
It was Rosa Parks not moving from the seat on the bus. It was the students not moving from the seats in the cafeteria. It was people insisting on their right to education, equal education. Specific people, but they had the general purpose in mind when they were doing it.
Absolutely, and if you think of the story of Rosa Parks, knowing that that was not just happenstance. I mean, clearly that particular day, no one told Rosa Parks that she should engage in an activity that would spark a movement. But in Montgomery, there had been an attempt all along. Teachers at the local college, Alabama A&M and elsewhere, have been engaged in an activity to find and mobilize the community for change. In countless cities across the South during World War II, blacks had boycotted the buses. They refused to deal with segregation while the country was fighting for democracy abroad. And so part of this is also the cumulative effect of people agitating for change. And we see it then in this pretty interesting period from 45 to 1968-70.
And yet, the struggle's not really over. I mean, there's a progression, but it's still today. We're talking about racial profiling, where police are stopping people on the basis of the color of their skin and checking whether their taillight is cracked or something. And we've had instances around the country where people are shot in New York, Chicago, Los Angeles.
Cincinnati most recently.
Cincinnati most recently, yeah. And there's riots for a while going on down there because it was the 15th person in the last, 6 years or something.
Yeah.
Unarmed generally, you know, not a true felon or something, but it was a racial profile.
Well, one of the issues I think that you see both this book but documents and suggests is that the country made race significant in the way it framed itself. It did so by the laws that were created to attach race to slavery in a permanent way. It did so in dismantling slavery during the 19th century. It would do so again in the ways in which it created segregation and the whole edifices for segregation. And then when it decided to take apart segregation in the late 50s and going into the 60s and 70s, it did not remove the power of race, both in the imagination and in reality. And I think we struggle as a society to figure out where to place race in our national discourse and in our national practices. And with the police, the tailgate issue, I used to studied police and worked with police in Minneapolis, and that's a classic operation. They say if you really want to look in someone's vehicle, you say your tail lights out, can I look in your trunk? Those are the kinds of things that police officers know and were part of training in the country going back to the 1970s. What we see here, and most recently, it really is, in some cases, African Americans challenging, suggesting a better way, not just African Americans, and then running up to communities where change is hard. And so the comments from the Fraternal Order of Police in Cincinnati would suggest that the president of that order says something to the effect, well, we don't want Cincinnati to become another Detroit or Washington, D.C., and so we have to be allowed to police and police hard. Which in effect was to say he had to be free to target black folks and young black men particularly if it was deemed necessary.
What I found curious after reading both of these books, and it's always been curious in my mind anyway, is how the word race is used in this country. It's a very imprecise, inexact thing. It doesn't refer to any particular ethnic background. It's literally just the appearance of skin, and trying to generalize it as just a larger type of racial profiling. So you get into these things of the one-drop notion in a country where most of the citizens are mongrels by definition. They're from all kinds of ethnic backgrounds. And making one particular race a distinguishing marker is just incredibly absurd.
It is, but it's long in the making. And so we end up, one of the things that I think most of us would end up saying is that while we would like to escape history, and there are authors out there who have professed that history is ended, I see no evidence that history is ended, and our ability to link our past to our present is one of the things we struggle with mightily. And race is a classic example. As you well know, at the end of the 19th century, there were multiple races. There's this book by Ripley, The European Races, and he divided up all of Europe into all of these categories, and there were races assigned to them. But as one of my former graduate students who wrote a brilliant dissertation on Italians called White on Arrival, there's a real distinction between Italians being a race as an Italian race and then the color, and color became white once they moved to the U.S. and became part of the U.S. sort of society at the turn of the century. And Tom Guglielmo in his dissertation sort of gives one example of the process by which European groups who were non-white in one setting became white in America. And it was convenient because white was better than being non-white, because non-white then put you closer to being black, and being black in the turn of the century put you certainly in a subordinate position.
That kind of gets us over to the other book, Love on Trial, because apparently, as you say, it's, as the title says, an American scandal in black and white, but is it? I mean, as it points out, people are still not sure of the background of Alice Jones's father. Maybe he was West Indian or Indian in the sense of being from India. But what was very apparent is the one-drop theory was sort of the pivotal issue.
Yeah, we actually use a subtitle to highlight a certain kind of irony, that we use absolute terms, but there were people who lived in the space between black and white. And Alice Jones's family, this is a story about a New York socialite named Leonard Rhinelander, who married a young woman named Alice Jones in 1924. Alice was a child of British immigrants. They immigrated to the United States in 1891. Both of her parents had been born and raised in Great Britain. And what would make her something other than white became the subject both of the lawsuit itself and the story and the nation's fascination with the story that unfolded in the fall of 1925.
It's a sad story in a way, and yet it's also fascinating, since it pivots on the notion of what is racial identity, an issue that was certainly intense in the 1920s when this came up.
Wow.
Oh, it's absolutely intense. I wrote this book with Heidi Artizon, who's now was a graduate student here at the University of Michigan, is now visiting assistant professor at Notre Dame. When Heidi and I started this project back in about 1995, 1996, we started to look at and try to understand how the nation dealt with really the ambiguities of race in the second decade of the 20th century. And what became fascinating to us is how much the nation paid attention to this story. When we tracked this story in more than 4 dozen newspapers across the United States, and North White, Black and White, East and West, and so it was in a sense that people were riveted by both the sadness and the profundity of it all, because it really did raise the question. If you're going to create a segregated society, and you're going to segregate the society along black and white terms, then by golly, you better be able to tell black from white. And if you can't tell black from white, then the whole notion of segregation is called into question. And so in some ways, this story about Alice and Leonard gets elevated to a national one, because if they couldn't tell, if no one could tell, then the whole sort of fundamentals of segregation going to be thrown out.
And this attempt to persecute kept sliding over into other issues like sexual innuendo and practices, anything. It seemed like the reporters were going all over the place, trying to find the very smallest detail that might be incriminating.
Yeah, no, this story started in part when a reporter for the New Rochelle Standard-Star sort of coming and learning of the marriage of Alice and Leonard. He asked us a couple of simple questions, basically wanting to know if Leonard had knowingly married a working-class young woman, and to which he answered yes, and had he knowingly married a colored working-class young woman, to which he essentially said, go away, this is going to get me in trouble, and leave us alone. Heidi and I firmly believe that had a reporter not done her job and asked questions. I mean, here's a case of Leonard Rhinelander came from one of the oldest and wealthiest families in New York. They owned vast amounts of real estate. They were multimillionaires. They belonged to the social register. So she sees that he married a local young woman. Then he sees he married a working class local young woman. Then he goes on, oh, and it's someone who's also colored in the language of the 1920s. And so she did her story. She went and asked. And of course, then from there came a series of other headlines and that followed up, that first Leonard had married a working class girl, and then slowly it came out that he had married a colored working class girl, and within 5 weeks of their marriage, he had then moved out of the house with Alice, and he would then file to have the marriage annulled on the grounds he had not knowingly married a colored woman. And it's from that, then almost a year later, the trial would go to court, because it's really a case about fraud and whether he had been defrauded.
Well, and as he left the impression that he'd be back.
Yeah, he left.
He never came back.
No, he left the impression he would come back. Alice thought he was going to come back. Alice's parents went on the record and told reporters, this is a momentary breach. Leonard would be back. He loves Alice, of course. And there was evidence, and we believe that indeed there was love there. They exchanged several hundred love letters that became part of the public record. There was some sense that his father was forcing him to do this to reclaim the family name and all that goes with being a Rhinelander in New York at that period of time. There were people taking bets, even in New York. The bookies were, and the odds makers were trying to figure out whether they were going to reconcile. And it really was then by the fall of 1925, a year after he first left, that it had become clear, not absolutely clear, but clear that he wasn't coming back. But even during the trial, people were still assuming that somehow they were going to settle this matter and reconcile.
Well, the trial was just a bit bizarre. I mean, they even had Earl Jolson come.
Yeah, this is a trial.
A man who used blackface comes to testify in a trial on race.
Yeah, now this is a trial that, in a way, you come to understand why people would pay attention. I mean, love letters get read into the transcript. You're right, Al Jolson testifies, and so you have the premier vaudevillian character actor who uses blackface to prove that although he's white, in a Russian Jewish immigrant background, he could become black, at least momentarily on stage, and yet without ever really becoming black. And so you get these complicated notions about race inserted into a trial, although he never talks about that per se. And then in another moment, the courtroom is cleared of all women and children because two of Leonard's love letters are deemed too risque for innocent ears to hear. Same day, later that day, Alice retires to the jury room with the judge in tow and the jury in tow, and disrobes to show her color and to show that she used the same color in part as when the first time she and Leonard were sexually intimate. And so
that part really bothered me. I mean,
yeah.
It's demeaning. It's no different than a slave auction or something. Well, let's see what you're made of,
yeah.
You know.
Well, but it absolutely is, but it's also an important signifier. It signifies in a certain kind of way that the jury had to be able to tell. And if the jury could tell, then anyone could tell. And if anyone can tell, Miss God, Leonard had to have known. And hence Leonard, although now he's claiming he didn't know and Alice had defrauded him, certainly had to have known. And in some ways, that particular moment becomes a signal moment in the crystallization of the whole segregation ethos. If you can't tell, then everything is suspect. But if you can tell, then segregation can live on. And
you and Heidi point out the defense or the case for Leonard was bizarre. in that he was portrayed essentially a numbskull, a total incompetent.
His lawyer had an interesting legal strategy, let's just say that, to prove that the young man was somewhat dumb-witted, and that he clearly was a young man who had been entrapped by Alice in her body, that she had used her womanly ways, I mean, almost in a Jeffersonian sense, to entrap him into this marriage, that had he been astute and had he been mature, he never would have entered into something as unthinkable as a relationship with a woman of color, et cetera, et cetera. And so, yes, I mean, the lawyer went out of his way to prove that his client was a dope.
You refer in the book to the novels that Nella Larson wrote in 1929, Quicksand and Passing. In Passing, Larson writes that the main character was caught between two alliances, different yet the same, herself and her race. Of course, Alice Jones's situation was far more complex. It was not just a matter of black and white, but something else. Still, she was certainly very much rooted in her times and the attitudes of those times.
She absolutely was rooted in the times of the 1920s and the broader attitudes. We are convinced that Alice, I mean, to follow up on your point, was passing. I mean, there's a real sense that Alice tried to live in that space between black and white. She never claimed, per se, that she was blind. She did admit to having some colored blood on the eve of her trial. But she and her family made a distinction between having some colored blood and being Negro. And what was more complicated is Alice had two sisters. Her older sister, Emily, married a guy named Robert Brooks, who was a transplant from Virginia, who was unquestionably African-American. And when you look at her marriage certificate and every legal document thereafter, she becomes African-American in the eyes of a broader public. Her younger sister, Grace, marries a guy, Albert Footsie, always in quotation marks, Miller, comma, Italian was the way he was always marked in the public record. But she remains white as a result in the legal documents that follow, because in part her husband was deemed to be white. And so if you look at the marriage certificate for Alice, Leonard was white, she was white too. And what made her, even her contemporaries noted that oftentimes she thought of herself as white, she acted as white, although there was some belief and perception that at least part of her family, her sister was married to a guy who was African American, and her father's immigration papers listed him as colored.
Well, I thought in a way, and when I compared the two books, it was also another example of a I don't say average person, but someone who is not particularly seeking notoriety or celebrity, yeah, who by taking a certain position ended up making history and advancing a cause.
That's right.
Just by tenacity of purpose.
Yeah. I mean, I think one could say about Alice that, and then every now and then many of us become these accidental tourists in history who've not only become tourists but then become the guides in a way. And in effect, what she ended up doing was standing up for what she believed in, which I actually think, and Heidi and I think we both agree on this, was love. I mean, I actually think that she cared deeply for Leonard and believed, perhaps naively, that love would win out. And it was no doubt very traumatic for her and for Leonard too, to have their love essentially put on trial and people watching. I mean, this is the kind of thing where, all right, marriages fall apart, relationships fall apart, there are family antagonisms that sometimes will pull a couple apart. But you don't have newspapers and millions of people watching your every moment and watching how you respond to both the cruelest of things and the nicest of things being said about you. And in some ways, then, it really was the glare of the media that really made her story both remarkable and also the dignity that she used to really persevere.
Thank you for being on Rip Rap.
Thank you.